Entry 22. The next 7 years I spent at the Joestar household, in other words, the time until my plan was exposed, were not enjoyable. It was simple enough to play the role of an eager and talented student. Fooling the Joestars, their servants, and my schoolmates was nothing more than child's play, having grown up in a cutthroat city where that sort of behavior was a survival instinct. After my first fight with Jonathan, he always held some misgivings about me in that time, but those misgivings never grew any further than that. I convinced him to trust me. In fact, Jonathan seemed ashamed of doubting me. I always found this humorous. That, however, was part of the problem. Everything became too easy and convenient. Things were too bland or lukewarm. It was a life with no stimulation. This might seem like exaggeration, but I felt like I would nearly go insane. Aside from the moment that I showed Jonathan my true self, I had no conflict at all. For someone who looked upon nobles with great hostility, that lack of conflict felt like swiping at air. I felt like I may have made some grave, irreversible mistake. Weren't nobles supposed to be great enemies? So why did things feel so tame? Was I pursuing something completely meaningless? Am I wasting my time? I thought. As I was not yet immortal, any occasion I considered wasted time felt like a living hell. Sometimes I was captured with the idea of simply letting go, letting my emotions explode, and making enemies of everyone around me. Somewhere deep down, I desired to feel again the adrenaline from my fight with Jonathan, only this time I wanted to fight everyone. To me now, I consider those emotions nothing more than youthful bravado. Those 7 years passed, and I never revealed my true emotions. I wore the mask of a good student and kept my head down. Eventually, Jonathan discovered my plans, and that peaceful era ended without my willing it. It turned out there was no value in enduring that blandness after all. There is little point in writing out the details of a failed plan, but nevertheless, to omit it completely would defeat the purpose of writing this record. So, I will remark on it briefly. First, I was adopted into the Joestar family. I legally became a Joestar. Dio Joestar. Now that I mention it, Joseph Joestar, Jotaro Kujo, and Holly Kujo are my relatives too. Not that it makes any difference, though I may have taken over his body, I did not become Jonathan. Jonathan became me. Therefore, I do not harbor any sort of positive sentiment towards them. I feel no familial bonds or anything of the sort with them. I had previously been branded by my repulsive father's name. Being called a Brando had always been unpleasant, but somehow inheriting the Joestar name was perhaps more unpleasant to me. Even after I was officially adopted, I continued to be called by the last name Brando at school. I never planned to become a member of the Joestar family, but the reason I didn't correct them was because I was never particularly attached to the Joestar name, so long as it was my officially registered name, in order to usurp Lord Joestar's assets, that is. I could have contented myself by claiming the debt Lord Joestar believed he owed my father, but then I would never be able to take his fortune. For that, I needed to officially become his adopted son, and that meant I had to call him Father. Of course, I did call him that, but I did not love George Joestar as my father. I may have written that I would rather call George Joestar my father than Dario Brando, but I begrudged them both. Dario Brando was a hopeless lowlife of a man with no redeeming features, whom I had nothing but disdain for. George Joestar, on the other hand, was a kind, sweet, gentlemanly man of great character, with innumerable strengths. All the same, I felt nothing but disdain for him. George Joestar's good manners and behaviors only made me angry. I think it was because, though he acted as a giver, in the end he was like Jonathan, an inheritor. I did not expect to change under his guidance. I would rather say I was anxious of that possibility. Either way, being raised by a nobleman, I started to think I, Dio, might lose the one thing I learned from my hometown, my ambition. That, it turned out, was needless worrying. My ambition remained intact those 7 years. I hated nobles to the very end. Not only the Joestars, but the self-important attitude they all held, that they sympathized with my circumstances as though it were the obvious action, was the most unforgivable thing in the world to me. When I killed my real father, I felt then that my life truly began. By killing George Joestar, I thought my life would move forward once again, out of that peaceful era. And so, unhesitatingly, with only the belief that it was necessary, I decided to kill my second father. I carried enough hatred and anger for the act alone, but I also needed an alibi. That was vital. I will continue this thought tomorrow. Entry 23. Continuing from yesterday. I waited 7 years to kill George Joestar because even greater care needed to be taken than when I killed Dario Brando. I needed 7 years to build trust and gain the right to inherit his assets before killing my adoptive father. I failed in that task because I used the same modus operandi as I had with my real father. That secret oriental poison, I was exposed because of that simple connection. As for other methods, killing him with a knife or a gun was out of the question. Nevertheless, in hindsight, I should have chosen a different method. George Joestar was in ill health. A simple cold, I believe. I offered to care for him in the place of the Joestar's butler. Instead of his medicine, I delivered the poison, which I prepared in advance, to his room and watched him ingest it. He weakened little by little, and began to display the same symptoms as my real father. The exact same symptoms. There was the rub. It became Jonathan's impetus in foiling my plan.
My only worry about what happens when I die is you, my son. Listen, Dio. When I die, send this letter and go to this address. He owes me. I'm sure he'll look after you.
George Joestar seemed to have a tendency to hold on to things. George Joestar stored my father's letter for 7 years. He might have considered it a courtesy towards the man he owed, but no, I don't think so. Lord Joestar knew he never owed anything to Dario Brando, merely a thief, and I was not the son of someone to whom he owed a debt, but rather the son of a thief. Knowing this, he took me in. Givers truly act strangely. I'm sure that if my mother lived as a noble, she would have done the same thing. The thought of it fills me with rage. But I digress. The reason George Joestar held onto Dario Brando's letter was not because he felt he owed something, but merely because he did not discard private communications. It was a habit of his as a gentleman. Given the size of his mansion, storage was no issue. My father had sealed it before I'd sent it, so I did not read the contents of the letter. I never imagined my father would have written the symptoms of his illness in the letter. This is what the letter said. Right now, I am ill. I know I don't have a long time to live. I don't know what the illness is, but my heart burns, my fingers are swollen, and I cough endlessly. When I die, would you please take in my son, Dio? Unlike me, he is an excellent boy. I'm sure he won't cause any trouble for you. Well, the latter half is only pointless dribble. What is of import is the former half, where he describes his symptoms the exact same as Lord Joestar's. Of course, it was the same poison being fed to him by the same person, so it would be stranger if the symptoms were different. By pure coincidence, Jonathan found this letter while he was studying the stone mask. One might say that the stone mask exerted its will in exposing my plan. The stone mask itself purposefully sought me so it could make me a vampire. That is, of course, fantastical thinking. The mask is just an object. It couldn't have its own will or desire or anything like that. I instead blame my own clumsiness. I was happy to leave questions unanswered, to leave the thoughts unfinished. So what if my father and adoptive father had the same symptoms? Maybe that's just how things happen to be. Jonathan already had a distrust of me. even before he witnessed me switching father's medicine with poison. Despite 7 years of friendliness, the things I had done to him when I first arrived, my antagonizing him, my actions towards Irina and his dog, had never left him. They must have smoldered inside him for those years. No friendship nor familial love ever truly existed. Even though he hated himself for it, he held a deep suspicion of me. 7 years earlier, I made a tremendous blunder in allowing my emotions to push me into hurting Jonathan. Had I not done that, and restrained my emotions at that moment, I could have easily slipped through his scrutiny later in life. Jonathan was the type of person who grows the more he is beaten down, and I carelessly beat him too hard. Without the aggression I threw at him, I expect he would always have kept that same peaceful and naive personality. Let's see, then. I have accounted for my clumsiness and mistakes. I have accounted for Jonathan's growth and his acute skepticism about the mask of my goodwill. But even after taking all that into consideration, what I resent the most is neither of those, but once again, my father. That goddamned father of mine. He left me absolutely nothing, and it seemed that even after death he still chained me. Even now, a century later, I still don't understand my father's aim. Why did he need to write his symptoms in that letter? I could only explain it as spite.
You are my son after all.
That's what he was telling me, a whispering so close to my ear I could feel his breath on it. It pierced into my brain, deeper even than the stone mask physically reached.
Dio, as a gentleman, swear your innocence on the honor of your birth father, Mr. Brando.
When Jonathan said those words to me, once again I blundered. Once again I let my emotions take hold of me. I should have conceded, the same way I had deceived those around me for the past 7 years. If I'd only done that, I'm sure he would have been satisfied, so why did I? No, of course I did. This is the one thing that I do not regret, though it cost me my plan. My father's honor? He had none. How was I to swear on something that did not exist? Jonathan, having an honorable father himself, never acknowledged that fathers without honor could exist. I suppose that blindness is a result of his own desire to be a gentleman. Entry 24. The world, especially when its ability is activated, is the fastest stand in history, but Tower of Grey is a close second. It seems that very same Tower of Grey failed in defeating the Joestars. This is an alarming situation, beyond my wildest imagining. The good news is that Tower of Grey crashed the Joestar's plane. One could make the argument that the real mission, to prevent them from reaching Egypt, at least he succeeded that mission. Even so, the Joestars survived both Tower of Grey and the plane crash, and I remain surprised at this outcome. The Joestar family will no doubt find it distasteful to harm further civilians, so I doubt they will use an airplane again. This leaves them with much slower land or sea routes. Tower of Grey gave me, at least, time. Time to find the path to heaven. Pucci arrives in Egypt momentarily. In the meantime, I will send more assassins to target the Joestar group. Firstly, I have already dispatched Jean-Pierre Polnareff and his stand, Silver Chariot. Secondly, I have decided to send the stand, Dark Blue Moon, should they use a sea route. Should they be defeated as well, I will consider going myself, but 2 stand users should be sufficient. This should nip my worries in the bud. Speaking of buds, I am astonished by Noriaki Kakyoin's stand power after being released from my flesh bud. I am told it was he who defeated Tower of Grey. Under my control, he could never have performed such a feat. His growth is a truly remarkable phenomenon. It may be different for ordinary humans, but when I, Dio, use flesh buds to turn stand users into subordinates of mine, they become structurally unsound. That is the only explanation I can give. As flesh buds interfere with the spirit and weaken the ego, They are ill-suited to stand users. The weaker the spirit, after all, the weaker the stand. This means it will be difficult to coerce good people into my subordinates using flesh buds alone, as that will weaken them too much. I must resort to evil. People like Undul or Jack the Ripper, whom I used 100 years ago. The ones that I should make my underlings are those not restrained by the bindings of good, those who are simply evil, those whom I may assemble as 36 wicked souls.